Yawa Jolene. Sego se waguego, or should I say Scanos waguego, to speak Kayokono. Welcome everybody in our little room, in our Zoom room. I saw a few participants, so I know who you are out there, some of you. But yeah, it's really great to be back in Ithaca, back to Cornell. As Jolene mentioned, I was the lucky recipient of a Canada-US Fulbright Award back in the 90s, and spent a bunch of time here at Cornell and in Ithaca, and was really a treat then to be on traditional Cayuga Chief territory, because my neighbors back home at Six Nations were largely Cayuga people, fluent born speakers, who had probably never had the opportunity to actually be on their ancestral land here at Cayuga Lake, not that I know of anyway, but wonderful people. I could still hear them sitting talking in the language in their kitchens when I was a young boy. So I was really, really lucky to have known them. So it's in their honor, I guess I'll dedicate my little talk today. But yeah, I want to, back in the pandemic, just before the pandemic happened, as some of you may know and we'll talk about, in 1924, Levi General Chief Deskaheh, who carried that title, was a strong advocate for Haudenosaunee rights at the United Nations, the League of Nations, I should say, on the international stage, and caused a lot of problems for Canada, let's say, as he asserted our rights. And so I was thinking about that as the centenary of that happening in 2024, in a few years, couple years now. And also Truth and Reconciliation, which I understand many folks here know, and probably people on the Zoom call, is a Canadian thing, a redress of the experiences at residential schools. My grandfather attended residential school, my uncle attended residential school, both in Brantford, Ontario at the Mohawk Institute. So I knew of that history pretty well, and growing up on the reserve had heard a lot of things about that as well. So the Canadian government took it upon itself to kind of, investigate this, get some of these truths out there. As you know, in 2015, they came up with a document with 94 suggested remedies for some of these things that had happened, and very few of them have been enacted 7 years later, but that's what we're working on. But I guess it got me thinking about the things that Deskaheh, or Levi General, had done in his day 100 years ago, taking these very same grievances to the international stage to call attention to these things that we as Haudenosaunee people have endured and knew about after a long, history of contact with Europeans and colonialism in general. So that's what I want to talk about, to kind of, and a lot of things happened in the last couple of years, the land back movement in Canada and elsewhere. But this particular photo was taken about 5 minutes from where I live now, because we live on the kind of eastern border of the reserve near Caledonia, where the development's taking place. So literally in our backyard or side yard, I guess. So got all these things are kind of percolating. In the middle of the pandemic, I didn't really have much to do in terms of putting things together. So I pitched this as a conference paper that got canceled because of the pandemic, as we know. So it's kind of a work in progress, but I just want to share some of these connections with you folks all today. So as Jolene had mentioned, and probably a lot of people know, Levi General was an individual who carried that title, Chief Deskaheh, which is a Cayuga Bear Clan title that was established about 1,000 years ago in this territory, very close to where we are right now. So there's a lot of resonance between that chief title, that legacy of what he had done, and it's important to know that there's still a Chief Deskaheh very much alive and well and working for the Confederacy today. That's the way it works in the Confederacy, right? The very first chief is just hands down that name. So all the successive 50 chiefs in our Confederacy have carried the same name as those first 50 men who were stood up 1,000 years ago, approximately. So there's a long legacy. It's not an individual. You sort of share that responsibility over time. It's a lot different than, and these are life titles, right? So once someone is put in these positions of leadership, they're to remain there for the rest of their lives. It's a lot different than political terms of 2, 3, 4, 5 years, where you can kind of shirk your responsibility afterwards. But here, you have to be accountable to your people for a long time. It makes a bit of a difference. Anyway, lots to talk about. So, but what I want to do then is to sort of set up Deskaheh as a historical figure, as a cultural figure, as a political figure in his time, and we're talking Levi General. Deskaheh who went to Geneva in the UK and lobbied on behalf of our rights as Six Nations. So that's who we'll be talking about. This is him, a glamour shot postcard, signed even, from that time. There's lots of things to talk about. One of the things that stand out for a lot of people is they'll notice that that's not our traditional headwear, I guess, for our leaders. We, as Haudenosaunee people, have gastoas, much smaller. These are Plains headdresses, and he wasn't the only one who was wearing these as a symbol of authority back then. Many of our people did, many of our leaders did. So I don't know the exact reason for that, because they would have known full well that this was not the culturally appropriate headwear, but I think it's kind of playing that performance a little bit, because the rest of the world understood that as a sign of, Indian chief, right? And maybe our folks were doing that a little bit too, just to call attention. I'm not sure, or maybe they liked it, who knows? Maybe it's kind of like wearing Nike of the day. But anyway, so that's the way you'll see a lot of photos with him with that headdress. Anyway, as you can see, this is when about the time he went to Geneva. I'm thinking that this was a series of photos he had done during that time, and there's a few of them that circulate from a studio, whether in London, whether in Switzerland, I'm not too sure. But this would have been around the time he was doing all his international work. He was there for about 18 months. So he would have also have been building upon these rich traditions of Haudenosaunee thought, right? I'm sure everyone here is familiar with the Kahnyen'kehàka, the Thanksgiving address. And that was our first kind of agreement as human beings that was given to us by the Creator, is our people are to acknowledge each other in a space, in a room, in a gathering, in a ceremony, in a meeting, whatever that may be. As human beings, we come together for an intended purpose, and we greet each other. I barely escaped a snowstorm in Buffalo to get here. I'm sure everyone had, other impediments to their way, but we arrived here safely, and we're to greet each other and give thanks for that. And then as a group, then we would collectively give thanks to all the outside world. We're experiencing some fall weather, the seasons are changing, Mother Earth is getting ready to rest, and the animals are doing their thing, and everything else. The trees have shed their leaves, but our great white pine is still green and growing strong out here, which is nice. Sorry for those on Zoom, you can't see, there's some greenery out back here. But anyway, so basically Earth's responsibilities, all the helpers are doing their intended purpose, and as human beings, all we could do is take care of one another, be kind to each other, build relationships with one another in the natural world. So these are the kinds of philosophies that are circulating in Deskaheh's mind as a fluent, speaker, as a ceremonial, cultural person. He would have known all these things. So I just raised that really quickly to remember that, he wasn't this one chief, one person acting on behalf of, our people. He was cognizant of our traditions, our ceremonies, our culture, bringing that to the fore, and as a spokesman for the larger Confederacy, not his individual opinions and ideologies, right? He would have been operating at a much larger collective setting. And I think that sometimes gets lost when we think about Deskaheh. He's held up as kind of like Joseph Brand. If people know Joseph Brand, he's sort of seen as the leader of Six Nations, when in fact he was just a small piece of a much larger political system. Anyhow, again, another visual representation of this. People may know this, the circle wampum. The wampum strings that symbolize the 50 Confederacy chiefs of the original 5 nations, and as a collective body, circling the people. Again, that kind of relationship of leaders working on behalf of the people to protect them, to always think of the people first and foremost, which Levi General was doing as well in a political arena 100 years ago. He would have been one string of the many, right, operating. And I think that's important. And all the imagery that's talked about, each of these chiefs are considered a tree of equal height, right? So in the language it says each of these chiefs will be trees of equal height, all sharing the responsibility of protecting the people, all linking arms and holding each other up. So again, all that symbology is taken from the natural world. It's a symbol of strength, unity, protection. And these are the kinds of things, the principles that were in Deskaheh or Levi General's mind as he did the work that he did later on. This, of course, is the Kahnyen'kehàka belt, the symbol of when we came together as a collective nation of people. The 5 nations originally, the Mohawk, Oneida, Onondaga, Cayuga, and Seneca, under the terms of the peacemaker. Again, about 1,000 years ago, they say, we united, and that's when we became the Haudenosaunee people, the people who build the house, this house of peace. And again, that collective sense of we're all doing this, we're all responsible for each other's well-being and wellness, not individual pursuits. I'm sure that crept in there over time, but for the most part, the ideology is the collective good. So these are and also the dish with one spoon, which people probably know about. Here's got a real live replica wampum belt of that one here. And I'm looking at there's multiple screens here and people to look at. I'm not sure who to make eye contact with. So, but this is a dish with one spoon wampum belt. And it grew out of this thinking I was just talking about, how originally our chiefs, the 50 chiefs in the Confederacy, were to eat from this single bowl with one spoon, like this collective coming together. There'll be no sharp objects, there'll be no harsh words, there's going to be good words between our leadership, right? And there's a couple things happening there. So, you see political turmoil in the United States and Canada, a lot of fighting, a lot of shouting, a lot of criticism, and then the people follow, right? When the people see their leaders conducting themselves in that way, it kind of, devolves into a bit of a chaotic, conflict over time. So the leaders, our people understood that, and it was said that our leaders are to not conduct themselves in that way, but to always, conduct themselves respectfully. And even the idea of the symbology of eating, right? We talk a lot about food sovereignty and this and that these days, but back in 1,000+ years ago, you weren't always, assured of your next meal. A lot of things could happen. You just couldn't walk down to Starbucks and flash a card and have a muffin and a coffee or whatever it may be, right? It took work, collective work, to feed yourselves and your family. So eating is something we don't think or talk about too much in a political sense, but that's what our people talked about and thought about how, again, that going back to the Kahnyen'kehàka, taking care of the people, making sure everyone's well and attended to. That's a political thought amongst Haudenosaunee people. And that extended, of course, later to other nations as well, but it had its genesis in the context of the Great Law and governance. This is a map, obviously, of the 6 nations in 1771. We are here. If anyone can see it or is familiar with that, basically right where we are now in Ithaca, there's a Cayuga village. I can't quite read it there now, but it's documented from 1771. And other place names, nations are in their proper places as we know them. The Seneca Nation, Cayuga, Onondagas, Oneidas, the Mohawks are up here in Adirondack, the Mohawk Valley. So this is our traditional territories at that time prior to the Revolution. But notice how the British understood this is the 6 nations, so the Tuscarora were in place at that point too. Kind of as the modern age, let's call it 240, 50 years ago now, I guess. And if you notice too, our trails that connected all of our villages together have since gone on to be the I-90 and the 390, I think, the 290. So literally the Empire State was built upon our empire, the Iroquois Empire, the infrastructure, the ways where the villages were and the towns grew up around, all of those things, and a very aesthetically pleasing place as well. But remember, a lot of trees, a lot of greenery, a lot of water, a lot of these things found their way into our understanding of who we are as a people, and even our political governance. Turo Wampum, right? Traveling down this river together, all that kind of stuff, built upon the natural landscape. Also important to remember. And these are all the things that Deskaheh knew about, understood us as being a nation of people in New York State prior to the Revolution. Of course, a lot of his work was taken up with in the aftermath of that, though, right? How do we protect our homelands after that cataclysmic event that was the Revolution? And this is a map that shows generally the same territory I just had up there, but this is the modern 21st century. You can see our little postage stamps here, there, and everywhere. Ontario, Quebec, New York, Southern Ontario, Central and Eastern Ontario, and also, of course, Green Bay, Wisconsin, and Oklahoma as well, where we have our peoples. And so even though we're, apart from each other geographically, it's all that clan system, it's the great law, it's all that collective understanding of our history that ties us together. I grew up understanding that, we had people in Green Bay and Oklahoma and New York and stuff, and even though we were, separated from each other, we were family. That was just kind of built into our understanding of where our Haudenosaunee communities to lie. I think probably because of the Six Nations, because over time I encountered other Mohawks who talked about the Mohawk Nation in a very singular way, which I get it, but I think because that's where they're from, those singular Mohawk nations with connections to the other places. But as Six Nations, there always seemed to be a collective sense of we're all in this together in our territory. That's why I was saying earlier, a Mohawk, or the Mohawk family, but surrounded by Cayuga people, traditional people. And that was just kind of the way we grew up. We didn't think in terms of Mohawk Nation or Cayuga Nation or Onondaga Nation. It was like, we knew who we were in our clan families, but we kind of all understood our collective presence, habitation here at Grand River. Just a bit different mindset. And again, Deskaheh, growing up there and being from that place, would have kind of seen the world like that a little bit too. And there's lots of history and cultural nuance I'm leaving out, but I'm watching the clock diligently because I'm used to lecturing for 3 hours, so I gotta condense things. But anyway, I'm just sort of setting the stage for kind of the work that he did in land-based and culturally based and politically based, all the kinds of things that were in his head as he did his work in early 1920s. As you probably know, at the close of the Revolution, Joseph Brant brokered a deal called the Haldimand Deed with the British, who surveyed out this 6 miles wide on either side of the Grand River in southern Ontario from its mouth to its source, 1 million acres roughly, and under the terms of the Haldimand Deed, the Haldimand Proclamation gave to the Mohawks and the rest of the Six Nations, which them and their posterity are to enjoy forever. It says right in the deed, signed by Frederick Haldimand and representing King George III. So it's a pretty high-level pledge of a sovereign territory. That's the way we understood it. But very quickly, that 1 million square acres was whittled down to about 5% of that in 1851. So that orange there is roughly the boundaries that were set in 1851. So what's that, 60, 70 years later? Didn't take long for the British and later Canada to remove us from those territories and put us in that place. And remember, this is the second largest reserve in Canada, land-wise. We're the biggest reserve population-wise, but the second largest land-wise. And it's not that big. You drive across the reserve in half an hour, 35 minutes. And if you've ever been across Canada, driven or flown, it's a pretty big country. But anyway, the other thing to think about is we're in the heart of southern Ontario, an hour from Toronto, half an hour from Hamilton, Kitchener, Cambridge, Waterloo, Brantford. These are all pretty big centers. This is the most popular region in Canada. So the fact that we retain our languages, our ceremonies, our cultures, our customs, all that kind of stuff is pretty significant. It's easy to lament the loss of language, and that is a concern of ours, but we also have to always remain positive that despite all of these things, despite the worst that Canada could throw at us, in terms of colonialism and oppression and residential schools and all sorts of things, Indian Act, we retain that thing. We retain that thinking. And I'm going to that in a second, it's because it's a spiritual responsibility, is the way we see our governance. Because as the Great Law was set down by a spiritual being known as the peacemaker, it didn't matter who was in Ottawa or in Toronto. We understood that our call to action, if you will, came from a higher power, and we conducted ourselves as such. And I think that's why Deskaheh and our traditional leadership have maintained that, and our ceremonies too. Despite what all this other stuff around us, all this other junk and things that are squeezing us, one of our old people used to say, we remain diligent in our upholding of our ceremonial lives and giving thanks, as well as our political life. And that's how Deskaheh would have seen things as well. But that's, when he's in the last speech, which I'm sure you've all read, is your homework, because I sent that along last week, so hopefully you've read that. But he's talking about that little square mile, 12 square miles of property we still have left. He's referring to that, right? So we're defending that in the face of all this other incursion on our property and territory. Forget everything else in New York State and our other holdings that we're still dealing with. He was dealing with Canada and this specific area of the reserve is what he's calling upon at that time, right? So this is a shot of the Six Nations Council House. You probably can't see it from where, but the inscription there says 1863. Before that, our traditional Confederacy Council had a wooden council house they met at, not too far from here, but this building is still standing in the main village of Ashwegan in the center of our reserve, built by our people in 1863, 4 years before Confederation, 4 years before Canada became a country. And as you can see, there's just people aligned here. There seems to be a photographer's tripod here, so it seems, I'm not sure the exact occasion. Maybe no, I don't think it's the opening, it's later than that. Because the original building was a wooden structure. They put bricks on it later. There's a bell tower. Some people confuse it as a church, but there's a bell tower, I think probably to call people to his attention to meetings. And the Confederacy used this as their main meeting space, but also rented it out, so to speak, for community events, because back then you didn't have a lot of community spaces to gather, so they did that as well. But it's the center of our community, basically. So I like pointing that out because, like I said, built 4 years before Confederation, that's our Parliament building, predates Canada. And here's another interesting shot, too, as you can, I don't know how well you can see back there, but again, you can see the wooden siding on the council house. And I don't know how well you can see this placard, but it says Sir John A. for Great Chief. So some folks don't know, but early on, Six Nations actually were able to vote in federal elections in Canada. So John A. Macdonald was the first Prime Minister of Canada in 1867 or thereabouts. Yeah, that's when he was, yeah. And so there was a moment there where our people could vote in those federal elections, despite what the Indian Act said. Well, I guess there was no Indian Act at that time just yet. But anyway, I don't know how many of our people did actually be involved in that, but as you can see, there's some kind of rally going on here. But you sort of see signs of affluence too. Look at the drive shed back here. There's buildings, the land's been cleared, horses and buggies. There was all back there, picket fence. And what's also interesting is the marching bands here. If you can, these are all our people with the tubas and the trombones and the big military drum. Our people, they said there were 3 or 4 marching bands on the reserve at that time. So it was a big to-do. So I guess all of that to say is we could mix our traditional council and political leadership with the kind of modern, whatever the modern, I don't want to say fads, the modern musical movements of the day, let's say, our people were involved in these things. And this is also at the same time as the Mohawk Institute, the residential school in Brantford was happening. It wasn't the kind of nefarious the way it later came to be, but some of our people were being educated there who went on to become doctors and such. So it was a progressive time. And it wasn't the kind of backward civilization that Canada wanted Native people to be part of, or that's what they said we were. We were always kind of adept with whatever was going on around us in a contemporary way, while retaining our languages, while retaining our political structure, all of that kind of stuff. So that was, like I said, 1860s, 1870s I shot. This is an interior shot of the same council house from 1910. So just prior to Levi General being raised up as a Cayuga Chief, but you get a sense of how, our councils were conducted back then. There's other interior shots, but if anybody knows anything about the makeup of the Confederacy Council today and how they sit in meetings, this was replicated in the interior. And a few of these chairs still exist around the reserve. We're trying to, I'm part of a group who are restoring this council house. It's in pretty good shape actually, but we're fundraising a little bit, and we want to do more work to get it back up and usable for 2024. And just draw your attention really quickly to a couple of things. People see the Union Jack back here as a sort of sign of, is it acquiescence to the British Crown? And I would say no. It's a reminder of this allyship, right? You'll also see clan flags. There's a turtle, a deer, and there were 9 clan flags that were made by I forget who exactly, but it was a visiting member of the British royalty, as a sign of respect and kind of repolishing that chain, if you will, of friendship with our Confederacy Council. So there was a sense of allies, a sense of nation-to-nationness happening here. You just have to look and think about it. Again, not from our sensibility of the 21st century, but from early 20th century, how we saw stuff. There's the Speaker of Council holding the mace. That's the wampum strings that are a sign of the council being in session. So this was in the middle of a council meeting. But yeah, lots to think about, even just the images. But I just want to give you a sense of what. So this is the political tradition that Levi General would have been a part of. Like he was raised up as a Cayuga chief just a few years after this photo was taken, in about 1917 or thereabouts. All right. So I'm only 5 or 10 minutes behind, so that's not too bad. I'll take that as a win. The other thing I wanted to raise really quickly, because again, he raises this in his, Deskaheh raises this in his speech about education, and we do not need translators, we are smart as your people, and this and that. So the Confederacy Council had also erected a series of schoolhouses on reserve around the late 1800s, early 1900s to counter the residential schools. So again, a very traditionally minded governance structure had the foresight to establish a school board, build schoolhouses, teach our kids reading and writing. They would have had all the languages at home, so kind of literacy, mathematical skills, whatever the case may be. And this is one of the schools. This would be SS number 10. That's actually my grandmother's brother, Sam Anderson, teaching there. He was a teacher at that time. This was about, this picture would be about 1925 thereabouts, I'm guessing, roughly, in the mid-20s anyway. And you see the kids here, they look a bit generally more happier than the kids you see the photos of residential schools, but this is on reserve. This is Marjorie Anderson, that's Sam's daughter. She went on to get a degree from McMaster University in French in 1936. So, I guess our school system then prepared our kids for university if they wanted to do that. But anyway, and Sam himself went on to be a Tuscarora chief later on in his life as well. And yeah, so anyway, just this, again, this forward thinking, wanting our kids to succeed, again, going back to the understanding of the Kahnyen'kehàka, like people taking care of each other, protecting our kids, protecting our future generations by doing these things for ourselves. Again, the traditional council was still in place at this time. They weren't a backwards thinking or conservative group the way Canada was presenting us at that time, and even some historical tellings sort of position us as being very conservative, too traditional minded, all that kind of stuff. We weren't preparing our community for life in the 21st century. Well, pictures like this and many, many others counter that, right? All right, so, and also I think about that in terms of education and the basic tenets of truth and reconciliation, about education. If you read, if you've had a chance to read some of those, there's a lot of talk in there about educating and updating Canadian curriculum around Indigenous cultures, histories, languages, all the kind of stuff that Deskaheh stood for, right? Telling history, sharing things, protecting our languages, protecting our governance structure. It's all embedded, all those things. So a lot of the things that he had raised, and not just him again, as he's just speaking with a collective voice, are the kinds of things that the TRC has taken up 100 years ago, if you sort of think about it in a contemporary context. He was very much for advocating for our rights. On an international stage, right? That's the big thing. So again, this is probably done around the same time as the first photo I done. This one isn't signed, unfortunately, but a very staged, very studio-like atmosphere for pictures. But they mostly all were then because we didn't have the technology. They didn't have the technology we have today, where everything is photographed and in digital quality. This has been a much more of a formal thing. But again, very proud. He was very much a celebrity. The times he spent in Geneva and elsewhere. And again, the headdress would have been like, it's drawing you in, right? And there wasn't TV, obviously. There wasn't social media, obviously. So you had to be an arresting presence in a live setting for people. So that probably would have helped. And then the message, people are listening to your message a bit more, I'd think. I'm not sure. This is a big wampum belt. I really don't know what that is. And the purpose of that, what that means. I mean, that's a close approximation to the Swiss flag, right? But I don't know if it was done in deliberately that way. His buckskin outfit is more closer to a traditional attire, I guess, but playing the part of being a native person, an indigenous person. There's other photos from this time where he's wearing a very elegant striped business suit too, so he was able to kind of attend all kinds of meetings with his wardrobe at the time. But again, this is the most arresting image, or I guess the expectation of a European audience at the time. So this is another fairly famous photo of Deskaheh with a group of, I think this is done in Geneva. As you can see, a well-classed bunch of folks. The Turo wampum here is displayed. The friendship belt, which I have here, displayed. People familiar with this one? Silver Covenant chain. So this goes back the Turo, I'll do it really quickly, updated that. So the Turo, like I said, was struck in 1613 between the Mohawk and the Dutch originally near Albany, Fort Orange back then, 1613. So the separate but equal, all of our cultural values, language, ceremonies, everything in our canoe, in your Iroquoian canoe, and all of the Dutch language, religion, all the governance, all in their big tall ship that they came up the Hudson River on. So sailing side by side, separate but equal, not interfering with each other, right? And again, going on in perpetuity, right? Off the borders, it doesn't begin or end. It's to be endless if we uphold our responsibilities. Again, going back to the Kahnyen'kehàka, what's our responsibility as people on this world to get along with each other? Not just internally, but all people would have been the discussion happening. And the reality of these settlers coming, we're just going to have to figure out, going to have to educate them in our ways to make good neighbors, I guess, out of them, right? Extending these ideas. It's always a big Iroquoian Haudenosaunee thing, extending the rafters, the ever-growing tree, the dish with one spoon, like to accommodate everybody. We're an inclusive people, not an exclusive people politically back then. It kind of had to be over time, but back then and even now, we're thinking large, right? He's in Geneva telling these very same things I'm talking about. This is a peace pipe, a silver pipe that I believe is still in existence somewhere that he traveled with. Again, the pipe of peace, right? It's a symbol that he's holding and sharing with this other individual here. So yeah, there's lots of photos from this time period, done largely for media at the time, I think in Switzerland, but it's indicative of what he was doing as the representative of the Confederacy over in Geneva at that time. So just a quick note, like as I said, he was one man, but he was one of 50 chiefs within the Confederacy Council. Deskaheh carried that title I mentioned, but he was also elected spokesman for the Confederacy in, I believe, 1921. And so that's important to remember. So that's a responsibility he had. That's why he began traveling with George Decker, who was a lawyer from Rochester here, who had done work on the Cayuga claim at the time. So George Decker, he doesn't get a lot of airtime in the Deskaheh discussion, but was one of those good lawyers that we all need more of, and was a strong advocate for Haudenosaunee rights here in New York and Ontario and Canada as well. A pretty good strategist. So he worked a lot with Deskaheh. So so he was the spokesperson talking about these very things I'm talking about, call attention to the lands that were lost, calling attention to the oppression that Canada was enacting upon our people, installing the RCMP, the Royal Canadian Mounted Police, the military police in our community. There was an issue of trust fund money that was appropriated from our accounts in England and later Canada without our knowledge. Several $100,000 taken, never paid back, as well as the various series of land leases that were fraudulently taken from our people. That's why the tract of land shrunk down. So he was advocating for a lot of things. One thing that always kind of struck me, though, in doing research around Deskaheh and some of his speeches and the things he was producing in pamphlets and sharing with audiences, he doesn't really talk too much about the Great Law. He doesn't really talk about those cultural things that I've briefly mentioned today. And I got thinking about that, like if he's, the representative of this long tradition, Why isn't this part of his discussion? And I guess the best I can come up with, and I'm just sort of formulating my thoughts around this, and I haven't even really discussed this with a whole lot of folks, but it's almost as if, and I guess this grows out of me having to give talks like this, where it's hard to separate small pieces of information to tell a bigger story, because it's all connected, right? It's all layered. I begin at the beginning, like the Kahnyen'kehàka, the very first speech or ceremony that our people were given when we were brand new people on this earth, and that was the first thing we're given. We still do it. Everything builds up from that. So there's so much to talk about. It's almost like there was no time to talk about a peacemaker. There was no time to talk about Taradaho and all the nations and all the chiefs and the clan mothers and all that kind of responsibilities. He kind of started with the assumption that we have sovereignty because we know who we are. We don't need to go into the cultural history of it all because it would take too long. And there's, you know, as you know, if you know anything about our oral traditions, it's full of, you know, wonderful, supernatural, powerful things that aren't for everybody's ears or even comprehension, right? So to talk about a spiritual figure known as the peacemaker, at this time people would have said, well, Indians are just superstitious, you know, Indians are just superstitious, those are double air quotes. Who knows, right? He just maybe didn't think it was the most effective use of his time, that the short time period he had to talk with people. So I don't know about that, but I'm just, you know, give that some thought. We can talk about that more later, but I'll just throw that out there. Because, you know, it would almost make sense if he was able to establish this long history, to talk about the Turo, to talk about all those long history of wampum. You know, we got 4 or 5 wampum belts here. There were dozens, really, over our span of contact and treaty making here in New York State even. Didn't go into that. These are always the core ones, the Turo and the Friendship Belt. Anyway, but he was, you know, starting with the assumption of Iroquoian sovereignty, an understanding of our nation-to-nation relationship that was ensured by the Turo Wampum, at least in our thinking, right? In the Friendship Belt later on in the 1600s. So lots to consider there, but you know, he was talking in the contemporary age to a contemporary audience, and just again, it was in the wake of the First World War, so this would have been 1923, 1924, there was a lot of attention paid to people's history, to nationhood, to conflict, all that kind of stuff. And in the last speech of Deskaheh that you've read, it was after all the turmoil happened at home, but he's reflecting back on that and placing it in the context of the First World War, this worldwide conflict that everyone knew about. But he's equating it with what had happened to us, our people being oppressed, talking about how our people fought for British causes in the First World War. My own grandmother was a veteran of the First War as a nurse, an army nurse in France. She was an active veteran of that. So, and many of our families have been, right? So we knew that firsthand. So he's using that language. He understands the formation of the League of Nations really as being kind of a direct or indirect outgrowth, at least, of Haudenosaunee thinking about this collective group of nations working for peace, right? That's what the world formed after the First War, knowing that, okay, well, we need to make sure this doesn't happen again. The Great War, right, they called it. 20 years later, they're doing it again. But anyway, they were learning things from us. He doesn't go into that too much either, that I know of in that talk. Even a very, very powerful thing to share and talk about, the peacemaker and how we brought peace to our people. But anyway, we got, you know, I guess as Haudenosaunee people, we have our sort of fingerprints, not just in North American history, but maybe international history, if you want to take it that far. And Deskaheh was the conveyor of those ideas. This image over time, of course, like this Friendship Treaty Belt, I sort of like this image because it's almost like a visual of that broken communication between our people, the Ongwehoe Indigenous people and the non-Ongwehoe people. This thing that's supposed to, you know, pledge us to always work together and be, you know, transparent in our dialogue and accountable to one another has been severed. This is just an old wampum belt that's kind of fallen apart after years of handling and things. So just a kind of a visual representation of that breakdown of relations. So here's another very grainy, sorry about that, very grainy photo of Deskaheh. This exists elsewhere in much better definition, but again, you get a sort of a full view of his attire, wearing moccasins and buckskin beads, carrying, I'm not sure what that is. Some people say that's a Haldeman deed or his proclamation, but like his political missive, I guess, to the United Nations. But yeah, so I'm going to take a real quick break there. Any questions so far? We can do this more later, but is there anything else you want clarification just before I move into my conclusion? Nothing? Okay, time goes by pretty fast. So, as I said earlier, Deskaheh, Levi General on the left is, it's a title that's been shared down through the generations for the past millennia amongst Cayuga Bear Clan men and their clan mothers. This is, on the right, is Harvey Longboat, a fella that I knew quite well and was instrumental in helping me understand these things. He also carried the title of Deskaheh in his time. And he was a good friend of my dad and my uncle. They played baseball together, grew up across the road together. So, his sons still live across the road from me, so us and the Longboats go back a ways. And Harvey was an educator. He was a school teacher at Six Nations. He went on to work for Indian Affairs and got his degree from Wilfrid Laurier University. So he understood education. He knew the problematic nature of it, but he understood that it was a way in which we could, hopefully educate others to understand who we are as Haudenosaunee people. A bit later in life, after he retired from all of his day job, so to speak, he took on the title of Deskaheh until he passed, but was a tireless advocator for education, for political. He was a chief at the time of Oka, for instance, and was instrumental in brokering some of the bringing some peaceful resolution to that conflict 30-something years ago, and shared stories about that. But he just was always an advocate for educating our people first and foremost, but other people too. That's how we're going to maintain this dialogue, kind of following the footsteps of Levi General, right? Like of talking to anybody who listen about and educating them about our ways as a people of peace. Who has, think about it now, we have some pretty sound ideas as to how to solve conflict, resolve conflict around the world. We see kind of brewing as people kind of getting very conflict-minded these days, not just here, but everywhere. So as a people of peace who have come through this over a long, long time ago, I think, the Great Law has some valuable things to share. And I think Deskaheh was part of that too, Levi General, to bring attention to these things. And that's why I got thinking about truth and reconciliation. So anyway, just to finish off this last thought. So Harvey was very instrumental in getting our Indigenous Studies program started at McMaster University, where I teach now. I was an undergrad at the time when he first started coming around to get that up and going. Now we're a full-fledged department as of July of this year, so that's great. And I also know that he attended conferences at University of Buffalo and maybe even here, I'm not too sure, but there was, at that time in the 90s, because I know the American Indian program was happening then, there was a lot of talk of pulling in the universities to talk about our things the way we're doing it now, right? So in full-fledged degree granting facilities. So we're getting there, we're getting there. And so he was a big force behind that, as well as Six Nations Polytechnic, our Indigenous post-secondary institution on the reserve. So a lot of good work had been done and has been done and always ongoing, and a big advocate for our languages too. So, and so I think it's that awareness of our history, it's that awareness of some of the land things I've been talking about, some of the political things I've been talking about, our presence on the international stage that has really kind of empowered our people, the Haudenosaunee people, to stand up, to resist some of these developments that are happening in our territory still over unresolved land claims. In Caledonia, you might have heard of some of these things, the Douglas Creek reclamation, more recently the land back occupation at a site very close to the initial Douglas Creek one in Caledonia, again just a few minutes from where I live. And it's been very contentious, it's been violent at times, but I think it's very necessary. Our people are, I guess, well equipped to take this stand, and based on a lot of the work that's done, the political advocacy work that Levi General had done, and all the successive chiefs in that role that call attention to we have this collective grievance against Canada that's ongoing for the last 200 plus years. So we're not backing down, and we're having some success. It's not the most popular thing for us to do that, and our people get arrested, our people are branded as terrorists and all sorts of things. We get a lot of a lot of criticism in the local media and everywhere else. But I think at the end of the day, we are all emboldened by the kinds of work that Deskaheh had done, Levi General. And as you know, the end of that story, because of the work he had done to kind of bring shame to Canada on the international stage. He was not allowed passage back to Canada. He never did make it back home. He only got as far as Lewiston, New York, the Tuscarora Reserve, and spent some time with Dr. Rickard's grandfather in Deskaheh's final days, because he was not allowed back to Canada, not allowed back to Grand River by the threat that he'd be arrested or his family would be arrested. And so this is Canada, and so when we're talking about truth and reconciliation, you know, there's people at Six Nations and his family would like to see some, you know, apologies put in place or some kind of recognition that if we want to talk about truth, hey Canada, you prevented our chief, our political leader, and our ancestor, if you're a family member, from coming back home because he raised the alarm about some of the things that you were doing. And it's not right, right? So, you know, that's why we're talking about him, and in 2024 will be the 100th anniversary of when the elected council was put in place forcibly by Canada. Some of the work that he had done to try to prevent that was to no avail. And he passed away, Levi General did, in June of 2025, a few months after the traditional council, of which he was a part of, was effectively dissolved. Well, it was never dissolved or dismantled. They were just no longer recognized by Canada. The Confederacy continued to meet after that, and to this day are still very active in our political affairs and have never stopped meeting. Because again, it goes back to that responsibility. It goes back to that collective understanding that we need to take care of one another. You know, politically, socially, in the midst of a pandemic, in the midst of fighting our land claims. And sure, we bicker and there's conflict and there's difference of opinion, but at the end of the day, as communities of Haudenosaunee people, like I said, we understand our connection to each other across distances and time and space, and it's something that we all share, and we're, you know, immensely proud of all of our families that have contributed in big and small ways to our survival, and to get a chance to celebrate some of our more notable political figures on the international stage is pretty darn cool too. So anyway, and so yeah, as you can see, the women, that's Norma Jacobs there in the center talking to media a couple years ago in the middle of land back things, maybe last year. And this is just another visual of this is number 6 highway. So this road running here is the, again, that's a whole other story, but that was the old plank road that connected, an overland route that connected Lake Ontario to Lake Erie, cutting through our territory. And so was part of one of our big land claims from the 1840s, 1850s, that has resulted in the more recent conflicts to stop development. Ironically enough, a school bus, the vehicle of transportation for young, you know, kids to go to school to learn these things, ended up somehow magically there. I'm not sure how it got there, but anyway, there it is. But just, you know, the power lines that cut through our territory as well. Touro wampum flag here, our people up on the hill. Some obscenities, I apologize, but hey, that's what comes with such things, sends a message. But anyway, yeah, so just standing up for some of the things that Levi General had brought to the world stage. We're still grappling with them, we're still doing them. And making a little bit of headway. Like I said, the Truth and Reconciliation is a national movement, yet to really produce fully effective results, but there's efforts being made, I guess. It's a slow progress. And this is the frustration that happens because of the things that Deskaheh and all of our people were raising around our lands and misuse of our funds and our lands over time, the fraudulent way in which they were taken. We've been saying that for a long, long time with no real attention being paid. A lot of indifference, the same way with the residential schools. Survivors from residential schools for decades have been saying there are little people buried on these grounds. And a lot of people didn't think that we were exaggerating or not telling the truth, but of course, now being proven true. So, yeah. So I just want to end on the note, like it's all about education and knowledge mobilization, all the buzzwords we use now in post-secondary institutions, and we're doing it now via, Zoom, social media, PowerPoint presentations, you sitting in this room, us dialoguing before our get-together here. Jolene and I were talking about larger academic projects to bring the story of Deskaheh to life in our communities internationally. So it's a really, really important movement that everyone here is a part of. And I see some of my professor colleagues here, John and Kurt, have been strong advocates for helping us tell these stories in their respective disciplines. So it's nice to have that kind of synergy in the room and to be able to come together again after not being able to do that so much the last little while. So anyway, I'm happy to answer any questions you might have for the next couple minutes or later, whatever the case may be. I'm not sure if you conduct things via Zoom or whatever, but I'm happy to discuss and clarify more. So, Nyawa, thank you.